turn. After failed talks, especially on Iran's nuclear program, Trump made a sweeping announcement. He said, effective immediately, the United States Navy will begin the process of blockading all ships trying to enter or leave the Strait of Hormuz. Not just Iranian ships, not just suspicious vessels, all ships. Trump justified this by calling Iran's actions world extortion.
The Strait of Hormuz is not just another geopolitical flashpoint. It is the pressure valve of the global energy system. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, about 20 million barrels per day moved through the strait in 2024, roughly 20% of global petroleum liquids consumption. That means any attempt to choke traffic here is not just a military gamble. It is a direct bet on the price of fuel, food, shipping, insurance, and political stability across the world. And that is exactly why this new debate has become so explosive.
And Iran is a highly nationalistic and tough-minded country. And when a highly nationalistic and tough-minded country faces an existential threat, it can absorb an enormous amount of punishment. So the idea that we're going to get the Iranians to throw up their hands and surrender is not a serious argument. Now, there's another whole dimension to this. Why have we allowed Iranian oil out into the global oil market? Why have we removed economic sanctions from Iranian oil? It's because we need that Iranian oil in the global oil market to stop the global economy from going off a cliff. Well, if we prevent that Iranian oil from reaching global oil markets, this is just going to threaten to do serious damage to the global economy. And then there's one final point. I'd be willing to bet that shortly the Houthis and the Iranians are going to shut down the Red Sea. And you're not only not going to get oil and gas coming out of the Persian Gulf, and fertilizers as well, but you're also not going to get those products coming out of the Red Sea. And that's really going to throttle the world economy, and that'll force the Trump administration to finally concede.
That is the core argument against the blockade. Not that Iran is weak, but that Iran may be too entrenched, too nationalistic, and too strategically positioned for this kind of pressure campaign to force a surrender. In other words, the blockade may hurt Iran, but it could also hit every oil-importing economy on the planet before it changes Tehran's calculations. If your viewers remember only one thing from this story, it should be this. In Hormuz, pressure on Iran can quickly become pressure on everyone else.
President Donald Trump said a U.S. military blockade of ships leaving Iran's ports had begun on Monday, as Tehran threatened to retaliate against its Gulf neighbors' ports after peace talks failed to end the conflict over the weekend.
If they don't agree, there's no deal. There'll never be a deal.
Outside the Oval Office, Trump said Iran had been in touch on Monday and wanted to make a deal, but that he will not approve any agreement that allows Tehran to have a nuclear weapon.
We're not going to let that happen.
Earlier, Trump warned that any Iranian fast attack ship that goes near the U.S. maritime blockade would be, quote, eliminated. U.S. Central Command said the blockade would be, quote, enforced impartially against vessels of all nations entering or leaving Iranian ports in the Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. 2 Iranian-linked tankers laden with oil products left the strait on Monday before the deadline, LSEG data showed.
But the blockade story is also a story about how we got here. Joshua Landis argues this crisis cannot be understood without going back to Trump's first term and the collapse of the Iran nuclear deal. In 2018, the Trump White House announced that the United States was ending participation in the JCPOA and reimposing sanctions, arguing the agreement failed to protect U.S. national security and did not adequately stop Iran's path to a bomb. Critics of that decision have long argued the opposite, that scrapping the deal narrowed the diplomatic runway and widened the path to confrontation. That historical fault line now sits directly beneath this blockade.
That he do something to bring down those oil prices, and blockading Iran is going to have exactly the opposite effect.
Now, many Americans, indeed many people around the world, are probably thinking to themselves, how on earth do we get to this point where Iran would have a stranglehold over, or has the capacity to have a stranglehold over an important energy gateway? Joshua, just put this in a kind of historical context. I mean, why did Donald Trump in his first term scuttle the Obama nuclear accords with Tehran? That was in 2015. President Trump scuttled them in 2017. Why?
In the run-up to Obama, when it became clear that he was moving towards a deal and Israel began to panic, a number of top generals in Israel said, we would prefer to have Iran moving towards enriching and moving towards a bomb than having sanctions lifted. Why? They explained, because we can bomb Iran in the same way we bombed Iraq's nuclear facilities, Syria's nuclear facilities. We can bomb Iran's nuclear facilities. But once sanctions are taken off, Iran will move towards 5 million barrels a day, 6 million barrels. They'll become rich and they'll become powerful in the region. We want them poor. We want to beggar them. And we're willing to take the risk of their enrichment. And I think President Trump fulfilled that wish. And he took the deal off that we have to remember kept enrichment at 3.5% and offshored the vast majority of the uranium. It was a good deal. But the Israelis thought that they could get a better deal by bombing. And that's exactly what's led us to the bombing today, is that they set out this strategy, over 10 years ago of let's bomb rather than sanction. And now President Trump is trying to fulfill that obligation, and Israel is pushing him to fulfill that obligation.
Now here is where the story gets even more complicated. The blockade is being sold as leverage, but leverage only works if the other side cannot endure the pain. And the energy data suggests the world may have less room to maneuver than Washington would like. The Congressional Research Service warned that a prolonged disruption in Hormuz would create oil market conditions with no historical precedent, drive shipping insurance sharply higher, and push emergency response tools to their limits. The bypass routes exist, but they are limited. Saudi and UAE pipelines together may only cover around 2.6 million barrels per day of rerouted capacity, a fraction of what normally flows through the strait.
Has the blockade started, sir?
Yeah, started 10 o'clock.
President Donald Trump said a U.S. military blockade of ships leaving Iran's ports had begun on Monday, as Tehran threatened to retaliate against its Gulf neighbors' ports after peace talks failed to end the conflict over the weekend.
If they don't agree, there's no deal. There'll never be a deal.
Outside the Oval Office, Trump said Iran had been in touch on Monday and wanted to make a deal, but that he will not approve any agreement that allows Tehran to have a nuclear weapon.
We're not going to let that happen.
There is also the nuclear issue, and this is where rhetoric and reality often blur. In the interview, Mearsheimer insists Iran does not have a bomb and says the dispute is really about enrichment capability. Reuters reporting on the latest IAEA findings shows a more precise and more troubling picture. The agency says Iran still has highly enriched uranium, access to key sites remains restricted, and inspectors urgently need verification access. That does not automatically equal a proven nuclear weapon. But it does mean the nuclear file remains unresolved, highly sensitive, and central to why Washington says it will not back down.
Iran does not have a bomb, and it's not pursuing a bomb. And lots of people in authoritative positions fully understand that. But what Iran does have is the ability to enrich uranium. And of course, if you can enrich uranium, it's not that difficult to make a bomb. And what the Israelis want is they want to eliminate that enrichment capability completely. And that's why they hated the JCPOA, because it allowed Iran to maintain a low level of enrichment capability, as Josh was describing. Well, Vance at Islamabad focused laser-like on the nuclear issue, and he made it clear to the Iranians that they can't have any nuclear enrichment capability. They have to eliminate it completely, and they have to give us the enriched uranium that they have. They have to give that up and give it to the United States. But the fact is, the Iranians are not giving up their capability to enrich uranium. We've been down this road God knows how many times, and the Iranians simply won't move off dead center. So J.D. Vance was, he was wasting his time, and that's why the negotiations led nowhere.
And then there is the enforcement problem, the question every blockade eventually faces. What happens when a major power tests it? China is central here because Asian markets take the overwhelming majority of the crude moving through Hormuz. The EIA says roughly 84% of crude and condensate moving through the strait in 2024 went to Asia. And Reuters is already reporting that a Chinese tanker sanctioned by the United States passed through Hormuz despite the blockade. That single image tells you why this crisis may be less about naval strength than about how far Washington is willing to escalate against the world's largest buyers and carriers.
I think both the Russians and the Chinese have a deep-seated interest in doing everything they can to prop up Iran and make sure Iran hangs in the fight against the United States and Israel. So the word on the street is that the Chinese are sending air defense systems to help the Iranians deal with attacks from the IAF and from the U.S. Air Force. And this is hardly surprising. It's also very important to understand that China imports a great deal of oil from the Persian Gulf. And if President Trump does put on the blockade,
Yes.
how's he going to deal with Chinese ships that go into the Gulf to get oil from Iran and bring it out? Is he going to board those ships and take them? Going to sink them? It'd be very interesting to see what he does.
Well, so
Tom,
General Jack Keane is suggesting, I think. Sorry, Josh.
If I can jump in for a second, in 1953, the last time that we put a blockade on Iran it was 1953 when the British led the charge in order to bring down Mohammad Mossadegh, the nationalist, democratically elected leader.
At home, this may be where the strategic argument collides with politics. Landis says the blockade could intensify inflation and hurt the very voters Trump cannot afford to alienate. Mearsheimer goes even further, calling the Iran decision a potentially historic blunder. Whether viewers agree or disagree with them, their broader warning is clear. If this blockade raises energy costs without breaking Iran, then the White House will be stuck defending a policy that inflicts pain quickly, escalates unpredictably, and offers no obvious clean victory. So, will Trump's naval blockade of the Strait of Hormuz work? If work means forcing Iran to surrender quickly, the case made by Mearsheimer and Landis is that it probably will not. If work means showing strength, it may do that for a news cycle. But if oil stays high, if China tests the blockade, if shipping costs keep rising, and if Tehran proves it can outlast the pressure, then this strategy could end up revealing the opposite of control. Not American dominance, but American limits. And in the Strait of Hormuz, limits can become global shocks very fast. The world is now watching to see whether this blockade becomes leverage, stalemate, or the opening chapter of a much wider crisis.